একটা এখানে মূল্যবোধের বিপর্যয় হয়েছে। আপনারা বলছেন যে এটা অন্যান্য পেশার মতনই একটা পেশা। আমার নিজের মতটা হচ্ছে প্রস্টিটিউশন ইজ এ কাইন্ড অফ ভায়োলেন্স অন উইমেন। এটা আপনারা মানবেন তো?
মানুষ কিন্তু আমরা ঘর থেকে টেনে আনি না, তারা কিন্তু নিজেদের মনের আনন্দ মেটাবার জন্য সেই জায়গাতে আসে। ঘরের বদ্ধতা অবস্থা থেকে তারা যদি বাইরে এসে কারোকে যদি ভালো লেগে যদি তার সাথে যদি সেক্সটা মেটায়, আমি এটা বলতে পারি না যে এটা কোন দিক দিয়ে খারাপ। এটাও একটা পেশাদারি, এটা কোনো অপেশাদারি নয়। আর তাছাড়া আমরা যে জায়গাতে রয়ে পয়সা দুটো পেশার যে কাজটা করি, আমরা লোককে আনন্দ দিই, আমরা নিজেরাও আনন্দ পাই, এতে আমরা কোনো কষ্ট পাই না। আমরা মনেই করে নিচ্ছি যে এটা কোনো কষ্টের জিনিস না। আর যদি এই কষ্টের জিনিস হতো তাহলে আজকে দীর্ঘ বছর মানে যুগ যুগ থেকে এই পেশাদারি জিনিস থাকতো না।
The sex worker performed a very important social role in pre-British India, and she was very much a part of the cultural, social, economic life of the nation. She was known by a lot of names like Ganika, Varangana, Sadharani, Nati, and many of them were very, very accomplished performers, very talented. There are references to them in later Vedic age. In the Buddhist Jatakas, there's a reference to Amrapali, who is a major figure in the Buddha's life. While in the Kama Sutra, she's something of an artist. She's the custodian of the 64 kalas, the arts. In the Arthashastra, she's seen as somebody who is a revenue earner, because sex work was an important economic activity. And in fact, the Arthashastra lays down punishments for people who abuse sex workers because they were actually valued as citizens of the state. And the Arthashastra actually talks about her in terms of performing diplomatic actions as well. So talented sex workers would be chosen to become spies, something like, a modern day Mata Hari. Once Calcutta was established, it started drawing a lot of migrants, traders, people who were associated with the company, who worked for the company. It was inevitable that the sex worker would be drawn to it for purposes of trade. At the same time, there was a kind of decline in the rural economy. There were terrible famines that were happening. Food cropping was being replaced by a kind of plantation economy put in by the colonial regime, who were interested in planting things like indigo, tea, etc. Traditional crafts like spinning, weaving, many of which women did, also declined, as a result of which women found themselves without work, men also. And there were waves of migration from the villages to the city. Many of the women who were coming to the city were coming to look for work in the factories, in the big households that were coming up. And in these households, they worked as domestic workers. But in many cases, even when they were factory workers or domestic workers, they would supplement their income as sex workers. And a lot of women from the villages were Kulin women, upper caste Brahmin women, who were expected to follow the most impossible regimes of chastity, especially the Brahmin widows, the Kulin widows. They had to fast every other day, they had to perform these rituals. So they were increasingly finding it difficult to put up with that, and many Kulin women migrated from the villages into the cities and became sex workers. If you look at the early 19th century caste demographics of sex workers, there's a large number of high caste women. That changes a little as the city keeps growing. Working class women also come and join the sex work trade. Initially, this was the scenario within which the sex work trade started growing in Calcutta.
আসে না আমার বাড়ি, গলি দিয়ে চলে যায় লুটিয়ে রূপলি শাড়ি, চেয়ে চেয়ে পথ তারি, চেয়ে চেয়ে পথ তারি, হিয়া মোর হয় ভারি, চেয়ে চেয়ে পথ তারি, চেয়ে চেয়ে পথ তারি, হিয়া মোর হয় ভারি, রূপের মধুর মোহ, বলো না কি করে ছাড়ি, বলো না কি করে ছাড়ি।
The sex worker was almost at the heart of the public discourse in the 19th century. She was helping in constructing the spheres of the private and the public, and also helping in class formation in a certain sense. The middle class was emerging because of the benefits of the colonial education and was defining itself not so much in terms of wealth, but through this idea of respectability, which they also acquired through a certain kind of morality. Now you had a new kind of class division based on ideas of respectability, Bhadra and Ether. So Bhadra is the respectable gentleman, and the Ether is the low class person who doesn't have manners, who doesn't have proper morality. Then you have the Bhadra Lok and the Bhadra Mahila. And the Bhadra Mahila has a kind of domestic status. She stays within the house, is educated, has excellent taste. Constructed against her is the public woman, who is usually the Beshya, who is abusive, who doesn't speak proper Bengali, hasn't got any education, obviously has loose morals. So the sex worker therefore becomes very important for the self-definition of the Bengali middle class. sex worker who was heterogeneous in the different services that she provided in pre-colonial India. She turns into more of a kind of homogeneous subject. She becomes a colonial subject, and she is very much a part of a medico-legal regime that the British put in place through laws. Because the British were very concerned about their soldiers, understandably, because it was on the shoulder of the soldiers that the empire was built. They were very worried about their health. They were also very worried about their sexual gratification. Fort William is very important to understand how the sex worker's life changes during the colonial regime. The sex worker becomes a kind of service provider for these soldiers who were garrisoned in the fort, but also officers and native soldiers commissioned into the army. Syphilis was spreading very, very widely, and it was developing into something like an epidemic, particularly among soldiers, because they were getting sex from wherever they could. So the British realized that in order to maintain the health of their soldiers, they had to have a source of clean sex. So they passed in 1864 a law called the Cantonment Act, which is basically an act that would be valid in the cantonment areas. So in the Fort William, they made sure that there would be a steady supply of sex workers who would be provided to the British soldiers. And these sex workers would be constantly medically examined to make sure that they were not carriers of disease. These medical examinations would be conducted at the will of the British. And sometimes when sex workers were found to be diseased, they were locked up in these hospitals till they recovered. They were almost like prisoners, and they had no rights as far as their bodies were concerned because they were constantly being medically examined. It was almost as if the company was acting as a pimp, making sure that there was a steady supply of sex workers for their soldiers. The Cantonment Act of 1864 was effective to a very limited extent because the British soldiers were not just confined to the garrison area. They were traveling all the time, and obviously the company couldn't make sure that they would be clean during these periods of travel. So in 1868, they bring in a law, which is the Contagious Diseases Act, where it was used again for forced medical examination of sex workers in any part of the city, because it was no longer a law that only applied to garrison areas. The most notorious institutions that came up under this law were the lock hospitals, which were almost like prisons. And women who were diseased were locked up in these hospitals, which were spread all over the city, also in the districts. It had huge walls. Women often tried to scale these walls and escape. And the treatment for syphilis or other venereal diseases was very primitive at this point. So it was extremely intrusive, painful. Women who were resisting the act would be rounded up by a particular police force, which was called the moral police, who were in charge of finding women who had not taken the medical examination and take them for these forced medical examinations. This law actually turned the sex worker into not just a medico-legal subject, but actually a criminal. And it's interesting that at no point was sex work itself criminalized by the law. So their bodies became part of a colonial project in the interest of so-called public health, in the interest of morality, in the interest of the empire and its soldiers. The Khidrpur docks are a very important area because this was where a lot of the ships arrived, and a lot of the sailors who came from these different countries would lodge around this area, and they would always be on the lookout for sex workers. It was around this area that a sex working hub developed, and many of the women serving here were European women, Eurasian women, Anglo-Indian women, but many of them were also native women. This area is also interesting because it's associated with Portuguese soldiers. And in fact, it was perhaps the Portuguese soldiers who actually brought syphilis into Bengal. Syphilis was a European disease, and There was a sort of raging epidemic of syphilis in 15th century Europe. And it's interesting that it then gets transferred onto the native sex worker as if she was the carrier of the disease. And in fact, in India, it was known as the Firang Rog. It was a disease that was associated with the Firang, or the foreigner. The Victoria Memorial is one of those British colonial monuments which have been associated with the city. Victoria herself is related to the history of colonial sex work in Calcutta, because when the law came into force in England, a lot of women belonging to a particular organization called the Ladies Association realized that this was a law that was taking away the human rights of women, because these sex workers were being forcibly medically examined, and they started a campaign to repeal the law, which happened in England in 1886. But the law continued in the colonies. In India, there were 2 delegates who were sent from the Ladies Association to find out how the law was being implemented in India. And these women were absolutely horrified by what they saw, because the law was implemented in a much more brutal fashion in the colonies, understandably, than in England. These women immediately wrote to their parent organization saying that we have to revoke this law. Terrible things are being done in the name of the law to the sex workers in India. The sex workers of India were then characterized as the daughters of the empire, the daughters of Victoria herself, who were pleading to Victoria to revoke this law. Comparing the British Empire to a family, and Indian sex workers to helpless victims, appealing to the Queen as their mother. For they said the Queen does not countenance it, for she has daughters of her own and she cares for her daughters in India. And the law was revoked in India in 1888, a couple of years after it was revoked in England. Chitpur Road is one of the very, very old roads of Kolkata. So Chitpur Road was associated with the more affluent sex workers who were supported by the city's rich and the elite. Many of these houses still exist, 2-story, 3-story houses, where the sex workers would be found lined up in the verandas, in the balconies, waiting for their clients, waiting for their babus. There is this very interesting description of sex workers sitting there chewing pan and using the hookah. And there would be these office goers, mostly clerks, who would be returning. And there is a description in one of these satires written by Durga Charan Rai, which is about the arrival of the gods to Calcutta, and are given a guided tour through the city. And they go to Chitpur Road. They see these sex workers who are lined up in the verandas of these grand houses, chewing pan and squirting Betelgeuse on the poor people who are walking on the streets. And one of these clerks gets squirted on by this Betelgeuse, and he objects and he says, why are you throwing this at me? And the sex workers become extremely incensed. They say, how dare you? How can you even protest this? Because who are you? You are a mere pen pusher. So these clerks were regarded as vermin almost by the sex workers, who were extremely rich women themselves and able to buy property. So they say something like, we can sit at home and earn 8 to 10 rupees a day, which you can't even dream of. So who are you? You can't even talk to us. So this tremendous contempt that the sex worker has for the salaried person, who she regards as not having any independence because he is a servant of the company, and this great pride also that the sex worker has in her own trade and her ability to have a kind of independent means of living. One of the very celebrated Baijis who were living on Chitpur Road from the late 1880s was Gauhar Jan. And Gauhar Jan later on became one of these very, very celebrated singers. She was one of the earliest singers who cut records, and she has about 600 records to her name. And one of the songs that she's very famous for is Raske Bhare Tore Nain. Sonagachi, which is supposed to be Asia's largest sex work district, has about 7,000 brothel-based sex workers and 3,000 flying sex workers. Sonagachi is famous internationally because it is seen as the site of one of the most important mobilizations of sex workers that happened in the late 1990s following the outbreak of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, where the sex workers were asked by the National Association for the Control of HIV and AIDS to provide condoms to their clients. So they got together and decided to stop sex work if condoms were not being used as a group. So this very, very successful condom campaign turned into actually a mobilization for sex workers' rights.